During the plebeian revolutions, a type of aristocratic government based on wealth as the new measure of nobility, by imitation of the patricians, would be established briefly in some states but would ultimately fail, and democracy was established instead. This government is what we will refer to as an oligarchy, which Aristotle particularly saw as a degeneration of a republic. The reasons for the reverse of these aristocratic pretensions were, firstly, the contradiction between the existence of privileges of a social class and the new constituting principle of public interest. Secondly, the strengthening of the poorest of the plebs, the proletarians. Thirdly, this new aristocracy had an insufferable deficit of legitimacy, by lacking the adherence and acceptance which the system of religious tradition did enjoy for centuries. In these said conditions, the establishment of the democratic system was made much easier. It is important to note that the revolutions that conquered civil equality were led by the leaders of the plebeian class, the rich, mostly to benefit their interests. The new social division was based on wealth, and the rich became the new aristocrats. This was partly a consequence of reforms like Solon's, which weighed the roles of citizens in society depending on their wealth. However, they lacked the religious argument to justify and legitimize their privileges. It was in the name of equality before the law that they had risen high to replace the old nobility, and that very same belief would be used to weaken them in turn. The new aristocracy of the rich wanted to have the monopoly on arms and banned the poor from participating in the military. The richest made up, like the nobility, the cavalry units, and the sufficiently well-off were hoplites and legionaries, relegating the poorest, if anything, to being supporting units like peltasts in the army and rowers in the navy. The elite plebs knew that arming the poorest could result in granting them more power through the increased possibility of a violent overthrow of the oligarchic government by the masses. This new regime, unlike the one led previously by the priestly class, dignified trade, industry, work, and consumption. Greece and Rome benefited from these principles that favored work and venerated wealth, just as they had benefited from religious government with civil and family institutions. These oligarchic governments often organized themselves in a sort of corporate bureaucracies in which the rich wanted to secure privileges above the common people, censoring their speech in the public arena, as well as excluding them from the military and from economic activity with monopolistic or oligopolistic policies, which limited free enterprise practices. The poorest saw this as an excess and a betrayal of the plebeian principles that had guided the revolutions. They strived tirelessly to maintain their legal equality with the rich. This situation would precipitate towards democracy. In Athens, the oligarchs couldn't hold on to their privileges for long. They obtained them by copying the old nobility in establishing a caste system of wealth. But the new constitutional principle of society was public interest and not religious tradition anymore, which means that rules were no longer fixed and institutions were less stable. In this changing situation, the new wealth aristocracy just didn't have the means to support their claims. After all, why would you as a proletariat be treated differently from a rich pleb merely based on wealth, which came from profit of market opportunities? Caste inequality made sense when it was a divine right given by birth because of descendants from gods and heroes, but not when it came to money. The classes of poorer plebs strengthened their demand for legal equality with the rich in many cities all around the Greek world. The cities where land ownership was the main source of income maintained aristocratic power for longer time than those in which wealth came mainly from industry or trade, like Athens, which soon turned democratic. As the isolation of states became a thing of the past and warfare between them more common, and since most of the army was formed by the wealthier citizens, going to war meant that many of them would die, weakening the upper class, and the poor had to be armed to compensate for the loss of manpower. This is why many cities like Sparta were truly afraid of war and didn't want anything to do with it unless extreme circumstances required it. War usually weakened the oligarchy and paved the way for democracy because it meant that the poor became more and more present in the city's army and navy and had more power to pressure the elite for concessions or simply to overthrow them. As each war reduced the numbers, thus the power of aristocrats, the very idea of them holding privileges without any moral justification and became unbearable. But here is a very important issue that sets the difference between these ancient Greek and Italian states and modern liberal democracies. The ancients struggled to make a distinction between individual liberty and political equality, and the cause for this was the omnipotence of the state, as families and tribes had been before. Having civil equality in law, yet no access to political rule in a context where the state had limitless prerogatives and no true system of checks and balances, resulted in no legal protection whatsoever. This implied that everyone was incentivized, or rather forced, to become literally part of the state. Under the democratic system that won over oligarchic pretensions of reverting to castes, every citizen had to vote, to participate in politics, and become a public servant, to be a part of the government. Then goes the reasoning for this. By being politically equal, they were finally conceived as legal equals and could effectively maintain the rule of law. Ancient Greek democracy did not conceive representative government to ensure the protection of the civil rights, especially of the poor. In fact, for the Greeks, the modern system of representative democracy would seem like an oligarchy to them. To prevent the state becoming an oligarchy in which a class of oligarchs may have been able to abuse the state to enforce and maintain privileges, all citizens had to be a part of the government. So says Thucydides in his book The Peloponnesian War, where he ardently defends democracy as the way for people to truly obtain equal rights and check on the power of the rich. The establishment of democracy in several cities, including Athens, was a victory for the popular party everywhere. The citizens in such democracies had to be politically active by speaking for or against a case, casting a vote, and being an administrative, judicial, or religious magistrate. The democratic state in Athens, nevertheless, maintained some titles and functions inherited from aristocratic government, such as the king, the archons, the polemarchs, the timostetes, the hieropii, the parasiti, the atloteles, and prytanis, involved mostly in religion and justice. Innovation came with new titles used in the administration, such as the strategi, astinomi, agoranomi, and metronomi. Pretty much every citizen was prepared to be a magistrate at some point in their lives. Religious offices were chosen by luck, whereas political offices focused on the military, administrative, and judicial matters were chosen by suffrage, which didn't imply less dignity for the latter, since suffrage in this system gave a legitimacy almost as close as the sanctity of a religious designation by luck. Above these executive magistrates was the Senate, a deliberative body remnant of the eupatride domination of the city and without much legislative, judicial, or executive powers. It merely served as a filter for the real sovereign body of the democratic state, the popular assembly. As Demosthenes says in his Against Neaera, the Senate could not legislate of itself. Decrees passed by it had to be submitted to the popular assembly. In the democratic system, speech and eloquence were of high importance because anyone, regardless of his ancestry or wealth, could publicly make a case in the assembly, provided they were citizens, married, owned land in Attica, and fulfilled their civic and military duties with Athens and with their parents. Ancient sources claim how speeches were viewed and listened in silence and solemnity by other citizens, because Athenians wanted to study every matter by listening to all different, often contradictory positions, in order to be able to vote and decide in the most informed way possible. We must remember these people truly considered the public affairs as intimately linked to their personal interests, because freedom, understood in this period of classical antiquity, merely implied that the polity could preserve its government free from foreign domination. While Athens was undergoing a democratic experiment, a very different evolution occurred in Sparta, because the Spartan aristocracy ruled for much longer than in Athens, and under an aristocratic or oligarchic republic, matters needed not to be discussed so openly nor extensively as in the democratic regime. This dialectical confrontation between aristocratic Sparta and democratic Athens would be one of the main catalysts of the Peloponnesian War. We will later talk about how the chain of revolutions developed in Sparta. So back to Athens. Speakers that were able to convince people with their decisions were known as demagogues, which means conductors of the city. The Demosthenes were the 6 magistrates in charge of proposing laws from popular initiative to the Senate. The Senate then discussed, voted, and passed these law proposals to the Assembly, and the Assembly deliberated, named commissions of speakers to argue for and against proposals, and finally voted and passed the laws. The enacted law generally had the name of its proposer. He would ultimately be accountable for the benefit or detriment it caused. So proposing, voting, and passing laws was a serious matter that meddled deeply with a person's life. The existence and functioning of the democratic state implied that citizens were compelled to vote and participate in the government. A citizen had to be politically active in deliberative sessions in his demos, tribe, and polis. This was intellectually demanding and time-consuming. It meant to examine each matter, for every decision had consequences upon the city and its members, and these decisions were in the citizens' hands, like, for example, the disastrous Athenian expedition to Sicily in 415 BC. Being a democratic citizen was a full-time job. With its virtues and flaws, Athenian democracy would not last. Democracy with a functioning state of rule of law was a brief experiment before a dialectical struggle of massive weight came to the ancient West. After the 5th century BC, the republics brought upon by the ascension of the plebeians would face unprecedented crises, and several parties would form, each supporting a different system. In the next episode, we'll see how democracy ceased to work, and how tyranny returned with the face of populism, opposed to those who wanted to protect the rule of law, and not make the city again the personal possession of a man or a privileged class. Feel free to donate to this channel's Patreon to support the making of these videos. We will receive any donation from our patrons and sponsors with plenty of gratefulness, as it truly aids with our enterprise of popularizing historical and philosophical topics to reinvigorate the study of the Western tradition. We also invite you to leave a comment below and like and share if you enjoyed it. Stay tuned and subscribe.